These are the Lubang Islands in the Philippines. By all accounts, its main island is a beautiful, quiet little archipelago about 100 miles southwest of Manila. But if you happen to grow up there around the 1960s, you might remember it a little differently. You might have grown up hearing stories from your parents about a mysterious boogeyman who lived up in the mountains and would come down to snatch up misbehaving children. Now, you might have thought it was just a silly legend your parents cooked up to scare you into good behavior, but it wasn't just a story. The boogeyman was real. He had a name and a mission. He had been up in those mountains since December 1944 with one singular goal in mind: to wreak havoc on the enemy and bring honor to himself, his family, his country, and most importantly, the Emperor of Japan, a living god and the supreme commander of the Imperial Japanese Army. There was one small problem, though. Just 6 months after Hiroo Onoda had arrived in the jungles of Lubang with his orders, his god emperor turned out to be just a man, the representatives of whom just surrendered to General Douglas MacArthur aboard the USS Missouri, bringing an end to World War II. A momentous event heard around the world and celebrated by everyone except Hiroo Onoda and a handful of other Japanese soldiers who would remain locked in time for up to 60 years in some cases, fighting a war that didn't exist. Hi, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Russell Futures, the only one without arms, and on today's episode of Past Pass, we're going to talk about Japanese holdouts. Simply put, these were the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army who continued fighting World War II even after the surrender of Japan in August 1944. These aren't just soldiers who weren't informed the war was over until a few days later or something. No. These were soldiers who fought for decades, up to even 60 years after the war ended. Why did this happen? I mean, were the soldiers not aware the war had ended? Did they simply not care that it did? Well, before we answer those questions, let's go back a little bit first and take a look at the history and find out how these holdouts even came to be in the first place. Though for most Japanese, the end of the war was a relief, it wasn't the end of hostilities for everyone. I mean, first and foremost, when Emperor Hirohito declared an end to the war, he never explicitly spoke about surrender or defeat. Instead, he simply stated that the war did not turn in Japan's favor, which might go down in history as the biggest understatement of all time. Nearly 3 million Japanese were dead, many more wounded or ill, and following the dropping of 2 atomic bombs, the entire country lay in ruins. So, yeah, slightly worse than didn't turn in our favor. Now, motives for holdouts are varied. Some genuinely never received any notice that the war was over, whereas others received the order, but they were so strongly indoctrinated in their military's Bushido ethos of fighting until death and the dishonor of surrender that their brains simply could not process a reality in which their leaders had surrendered. Again, since Hirohito didn't specifically use this language, it may not have helped matters either. Bushido, by the way, or the way of the warrior, is the code of conduct of the samurai, and in the first half of the 20th century, this code informed every aspect of Japanese life, including civilian morale and ethical training, military training. Under this code, not only was surrender unthinkable, but the most honorable fate for a warrior was to die while taking as many enemies with him as possible, to kamikaze. And this applied not just to the men fighting in the war. We're talking civilians, women leaping off of cliffs with their children in their arms in order to avoid capture by the evil American colonialists. Honestly, reading about some of the murder-suicides on the island of Okinawa, where it was really prevalent, is pretty disturbing. And if you do want to learn more about it, please do so at your own discretion. Just be aware, it's pretty horrifying stuff. Anyway, kamikaze, that was a well-known war tactic too, of course, ever since suicide bombers struck Allied warships in 1944. It's estimated more than 3,000 Japanese pilots and 7,000 American, Australian, and British personnel lost their lives in kamikaze attacks. Bushido codes and kamikaze attacks and the no-surrender mentality all stemmed from a fanatical devotion to the emperor. So you have to understand that the emperor in Japanese culture, at least from the 6th century onwards, was considered to be, quote, descended from the kami, or gods, and he was in contact with them and often inspired by them. This didn't make him a god in the way we understand it, but rather imposed on him the obligation of carrying out certain rituals and devotions in order to ensure that the kami, or gods, looked after Japan properly and ensured its prosperity. It's very similar to the rulers of ancient Rome or Egypt, or even medieval kings. People thought Henry VI could cure diseases with the royal touch. I guess if people think you're descended from a god, you're basically a god, because you can do no wrong and anything you say or do is essentially divine and infallible, which explains a lot of the actions taken by Japanese citizens and soldiers during this time period. Okay, back to the surrendering thing. Aside from the shame of it, Japanese soldiers could also face consequences for surrendering or being taken prisoner. The Army Discipline Code of 1942 prescribed a minimum of 6 months imprisonment if a soldier was taken prisoner, regardless of the circumstance. Now, this still paled in comparison to the War Minister's Field Service Code, though, also known as Senjinkun, in 1941. According to my source, quote, the release of Senjinkun was accompanied by a heavy propaganda campaign that featured a pop music recital and the release of a phonograph of the Song of Senjinkun. From this time on, it was unofficially understood both in the Japanese army and in the wider Japanese culture that surrender was a crime deserving of death. Once we understand just how dishonorable surrendering was to the Japanese, it becomes a bit more clear why these holdouts may have existed in the first place. There are other reasons, of course, post-traumatic stress being one of them. History Collection argues that some of these holdouts believed Japan's claims that the war was fought to free fellow Asians from European colonialism, and so they stayed behind or joined anti-colonial movements. As there were thousands of holdouts, we can't know every single person's reasoning. Some of them turned themselves in, some committed suicide, and others, cut off from supplies of food and medicine, starved to death or succumbed to illness. Others were tracked down and killed. There are some sources devoted to forming a timeline surrounding some of these holdouts, and you can see that a vast number of them were discovered or informed of the war's end by the end of the decade. For example, in early 1947, a band of 33 Japanese soldiers attacked an American Marine patrol by Peleliu Island in Micronesia, unaware that the war was over. American patrols with a Japanese admiral had to convince them. Around that same time, on Palawan Island in the Philippines, 7 Japanese troops armed with a mortar launcher just strolled right out of the jungle. Then, in late 1948 in China, an estimated 10 to 20,000 well-equipped Japanese troops had been caught in what's described as a no man's land of civil war, stuck between the warring nationalists and communist forces, and had been unable to surrender. But after 1953, though, every single case mentioned is about 1 or 2 soldiers being discovered. And today we're going to focus on the holdouts that weren't found for decades, and some of the most extreme examples I could find. Shoichi Yokoi was one of the last known Japanese holdouts. He wasn't discovered until 1972 in the jungles of Guam. Yokoi was a sergeant in the JIA, the Japanese Imperial Army, and had been stationed there during the Japanese occupation of the island from 1941 to 1944. Yokoi himself arrived there in February 1943. In July the following year, American forces engaged in a bloody battle there, and Yokoi's regiment was in shambles. Yokoi himself was believed to be dead, and by 1955, his death was official. Yet, during all that time, Yokoi survived in Guam, living off the land. He wove hibiscus bark fiber together to make cloth and sewed it into clothes. He caught or found his own food. He even made shoes from just crap laying around from the war. Originally, actually, Yokoi was with a small group of people, but tensions divided them, and then some people left. Others were shot and killed by the patrolling American soldiers. But once a year had passed since the war had ended, it was only Yokoi and 2 other guys. Eventually, Yokoi left them over a disagreement over food preparation and storage. Yokoi is quoted as saying, "We dug a cave in a bamboo thicket, but after a few months our food ran out. The others moved to a new hiding place where there was more food. We visited each other." My other source adds, the 3 agreed they should limit their contact with each other to avoid being detected. Yokoi took 3 months to construct his cave about 500 meters away from the one he left behind. The interior of Yokoi's cave was about 3 feet high and 9 feet long, and about 7 feet underground. The cave was supported by strong bamboo canes and was accessible through a narrow, concealed hole with a ladder. The floors and walls were covered with bamboo, and he even constructed an indoor toilet. The other 2 soldiers had been his only human contact until about 8 years before he was captured, when he found them dead. He buried his former companions in a cave, which he revealed to officials after he was captured. Okay, so Yokoi was discovered by some local hunters in 1972, and he still believed that the war was going on, that his life was in danger. He thought he'd been taken prisoner. A great shame for a Japanese soldier, remember? And he panicked. Apparently, as these hunters led him away, he begged for them to kill him there and then. Of course, they didn't, right? And 2 weeks after being discovered, Yokoi returned to Japan with a hero's welcome. He wrote a best-selling book about it and even ran for a seat in Japan's upper house of parliament, though ultimately he was unsuccessful. And he's not the only one either. More than a few of these Japanese holdouts get into government later as far-right politicians, which is kind of scary. During an audience with Emperor Akihito in later years, Yokoi stated, quote, "Your Majesties, I have returned home. I deeply regret that I could not serve you well. The world has certainly changed, but my determination to serve you will never change." And the world definitely did change since Yokoi last saw it, and unfortunately, he struggled to adapt. It's said that he struggled with nightmares of being chased by enemy soldiers all the way up until his death in 1977 from a heart attack. And though it's been neglected, you can still go and visit Yokoi's cave in Guam to this day. Okay, let's talk about that guy I mentioned in the intro, Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda. He is one of the most famous Japanese holdouts, and he wasn't discovered until 1974. Apparently, the first time he and his 3 enlisted soldiers heard about Japan's surrender was in October 1945, a couple of months after the war had ended. Another cell of rogue soldiers showed them a leaflet that implored them to come down from the mountain, but Onoda dismissed it. He believed it was fake, an American forgery. After the war ended, Hiroo remained at his jungle post on an island in the Philippines for almost 30 years. It's said that he survived on bananas and coconuts, and sometimes he'd venture out to kill a few villagers who he thought were enemies. Just imagine you're like a local farmer in the area. You just kind of have to get used to the idea that at any moment, a Japanese soldier could burst out of the forest and steal a few of your cattle, burn down your silos or your farms, and even kill you. It sounds pretty horrifying, right? Years later, they tried to drop leaflets on them again, and once again, they were dismissed as fakes. Onoda was fighting a non-existent war. Despite Hiroo and his comrades needlessly killing an estimated 30 Filipinos after the war, he returned to Japan a hero all the same. Personally, I got some mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I understand Hiroo, he didn't know the war was over, and he genuinely believed he was defending himself and protecting a sacred mission, right? I mean, he grew up in Japan. He was indoctrinated his entire life into this Bushido culture. On the other hand, he killed a bunch of innocent people way after the war was over for basically no reason. So, yeah, I'm curious what people think about this one. It's tough. All right, let's continue on here with a quote from the New York Times. Quote, "Considering themselves to be at war, they evaded American and Filipino search parties and attacked islanders they took to be enemy guerrillas. One of the enlisted men surrendered to Filipino forces in 1950, and 2 others were shot dead, one in 1954 and another in 1972, by island police officers searching for the renegades. The last holdout, Lieutenant Onoda, officially declared dead in 1959, was found in 1974 by a student named Norio Suzuki. The lieutenant rejected Mr. Suzuki's pleas to go home at first, insisting he was still awaiting orders. Mr. Suzuki then returned with photographs proving the war was over, and the Japanese government sent a delegation, including the lieutenant's brother and his former commander, to relieve him of duty formally. Onoda actually went on to describe this experience in his book, No Surrender, My 30 Years War. The book's pretty good. I recommend you go check it out, although it is a little bit biased considering Onoda wrote it himself, but still an interesting read nonetheless. Oh, by the way, I have to slide in a quote here from the Suzuki guy who found him, the student. Apparently, after he got done touring around the world and he got back home in Japan, he was feeling a little restless, and he sees the reports on the news of these other unsuccessful attempts to find Onoda, and Suzuki decides he's going to go find him, stating that he wants to go out and search for, quote, Lieutenant Onoda, a and the abominable snowman, which is amazing. Now, if you're wondering why it took so long to find Onoda and his buddies, not only did they actively flee from search parties, but Onoda was actually declared dead. Stands to reason that people may not have been actually looking for him in the later years. Apparently, it was only after the third soldier Onoda was with, Kozuka, died and was brought back to Japan in 1972 that rumors and word about the change of Onoda still being alive spread, and that's when Suzuki, curious, inspired by the stories, found him. Onoda was actually going to shoot Suzuki on sight before Suzuki yelled at him, "Onoda-san, the Emperor and people of Japan are worried about you," and that apparently stopped him. It also took his former major personally relieving him of duty for Onoda to officially stand down. And then his surrender was accepted. He was formally pardoned by President Fernando Marcos of the Philippines. And then he went back to Japan and signed a big-ass contract for that book I mentioned earlier. So he is clearly the most popular and most known of the Japanese holdouts. He passed away in 2014 at the age of 91. After becoming a cattle rancher in Brazil, and then later setting up a school for troubled children with his wife. Okay, let's just step back here a second and evaluate, because I have to say, when I first heard this story, I completely bought into the idea that Onoda was essentially brainwashed into believing that his country could not possibly have surrendered. I can't help but wonder if he was actually brainwashed or just in denial, because the alternative was just too painful. I don't know, is there a difference between those two things? Also, just imagine this happening today, right? Imagine a soldier from some army hiding out in the mountains, ignoring clear evidence that the war is in fact over, orders from his superiors, photographs, 30 years passing by, on and on and on, and instead deciding to steal from and murder dozens of local civilians. When it's all over, when you come back to the real world, you write a book about it and don't make one mention of all the atrocities you committed. No apology, no show of remorse for killing all those people. I don't know. It's just, he doesn't sound like much of a hero to me. He, unfortunately, sounds like a mindless tool of the war machine who, at best, drank too much of the Kool-Aid and he couldn't handle reality, or at worst, actually preferred living in the jungle, killing innocent people over the alternative, admitting defeat. And yes, I know how hard that would have been for him, but come on, it was 30 years, guys. 30 years. You don't think deep down he knew what the truth was? Did he even at least try to investigate for himself whether or not the war was over? It sounds like he just kind of hung out in the mountains, occasionally coming down to terrorize local farmers. Let me know what you guys think. Whatever you think about it, though, he definitely is the most famous of the holdouts. Which brings us to our next one, Teruya Nakamura. He was a holdout that was found in 1974. He's also known as Sunio and is widely considered to be the last of all the holdouts. Others say that title goes to Onoda for a number of reasons we'll get into in just a moment. But anyway, Nakamura had actually grown up in Formosa, Taiwan, which was then a Japanese possession that had been seized from China at the end of the 19th century. And he was a member of the indigenous Aboriginal people, and his birth name is believed to be Atun Palalin. Now, some say he took on a Japanese name when he either was conscripted or volunteered to join the war effort in 1943. It's hard to tell because some sources disagree on that, but according to one source, the wartime choices forced on Nakamura's unit were similar to those made by many other Imperial Japanese Army troops, confronting Allied landings on small islands. Forced to make the best of limited supplies, faced by overwhelming numbers and lacking proper air support, they either sacrificed themselves in hopeless attempts at defense or retreated into the interior. Morotai, Indonesia, an island of about 700 square miles, was large enough to make the latter option a realistic one, and Nakamura was fortunate that his unit was ordered to disperse and commence a guerrilla campaign soon after the invasion happened. By the time the war actually ended, 11 months later, he was part of a dwindling group of soldiers that seemed to have repeatedly dispersed and coalesced, breaking into ever smaller parties to hunt for food deep in the jungle, and regularly losing members to starvation and disease. According to the survivors of one of these small parties, 9 men who were discovered and repatriated in 1956, Nakamura possessed a high degree of self-sufficiency. He went off to live on his own in the jungle between 1946 and 1947, returned to the main group in 1950, and then disappeared again a few years later. Other sources say that in no uncertain terms Nakamura had been forced to enlist, so unsure of the situation, he stayed hidden in the jungle the entire time. They also alleged that he lost contact with his group when landing on Morta Island, and in 1944, he'd been declared dead. He also assumed the war wasn't over, since planes continually flew overhead each day, only for it to later be discovered that the jungle was near an Indonesian Air Force base. While planes improved, becoming sleeker and faster, Nakamura simply figured it was a sign of an arms race. "I made one simple wrong judgment, and it cost me 30 years, he said. He had this small clearing in the mountains they called Nakamura City, and he basically lived there for decades. But the idea that there was some Japanese army straggler on the island was kind of ridiculous until Onoda's surrender. Then reports start coming in of Nakamura roaming the jungle, and then someone spots his hut from the air. He gets rescued, taken to a hospital, and celebrated. Though not nearly as much as Onoda, because Nakamura was kind of seen more as like a hermit by comparison, a man just chilling in the woods, keeping to himself, whereas Lieutenant Onoda, he was still actively fighting the enemy for 30 years, even though he was just murdering random farmers. But it's just an interesting dynamic. Government gives him a couple $100 for his service and sends him on his way back to Taiwan, where he lived out the rest of his unfortunately short life. One source claims that upon his return, his parents were dead and only 2 of his siblings survived. His wife's new husband, of more than 10 years, was originally willing to move out, which is crazy, but Nakamura decided not to disturb their life, and he just, bought an apartment nearby and hung out. Another source says that his wife later reconsidered her position and actually left her second husband to reconcile with him, but unfortunately both sources agree that only 4 years after returning to some sense of normalcy, Nakamura passed away due to lung cancer in 1979, which kind of sucks. He didn't write a book about his story. He's not as popular as Onoda in Japan, at least. And generally speaking, there are far less sources discussing him, so we just don't know a lot about him. But, hopefully he won't be forgotten. He's certainly an interesting figure in history. So, is that it? Any more holdouts? Well, yes, Nakamura was the last confirmed holdout, but it doesn't really end there. In 1997, newspapers reported that yet another holdout was found in the Philippines. The article read, "An 85-year-old Japanese soldier has been found on the Philippine island of Mindoro. Under the name Sangreban, he had been living among the Mangyang tribe for 54 years. He had a wife from the tribe who had given him 4 children, and he was in very good health," according to Rufino Baldo, a member of a team searching for such Japanese stragglers. Sangreban was one of a group of soldiers who landed on the island in 1943 with orders not to surrender under any circumstances. He thought that American leaflets dropped over the island in 1945 declaring the war was over were a propaganda trick. So after his companions died, he went native. According to one of the search party, quote, "He has blocked out nearly all of his memories of pre-war Japan, but he still speaks an old-fashioned form of Japanese," end quote. He does not want to leave his sick wife and is unlikely to return to Japan. Now, though this story sounds familiar, ignoring the leaflets and having a hard time believing that the war was over, this article was proven to be false. After some fact-checking, the Japanese news media learned this was a hoax, and the guy that was the alleged holdout didn't know any Japanese whatsoever. But this goes even further. The most recent holdout claim is actually as late as 2005. 2 elderly men in the Philippines, Yoshio Yamakawa, 87, and Tsuki Nagauchi, 85, both said they emerged from Mindanao 60 years after the war ended. Though this would be incredible if true, the story was kind of fishy from the beginning. Suspicion rose that this was actually a hoax or a trap set up by kidnappers, and there wasn't actually much proof that these guys ever existed. The Prime Minister himself, Junichiro Koizumi, said that he wanted to verify the stories and help the men. If they are alive, we'd like to fulfill their wishes. If this turns out to be true, it will be quite a surprise. They have done really well to stay alive this long, he said in a statement. Days after the news report dropped, still nothing was confirmed. A close associate of a veterans organization in Japan said that he was confident the men existed and that they produced some form of identification. From my sources, it kind of seems like they had a mediator contact the Japanese embassy for them. But either they didn't show up to the meeting or they did and then they left suddenly and they were never seen again. And so we don't know what happened. Even the Japanese consul for Davao, the main city in Mindanao, said that this story seemed credible and someone promised concrete information. Multiple sources reported on this as well, because if it was true, well, this would be the first time a holdout was discovered in over 30 years. Some claim the men may have survived by marrying Filipino women and adopting Filipino names. One of the men allegedly had a wife and children and grandchildren. Since about 13,000 men either died or went missing in Mindanao during the war, it's not unreasonable to think that 2 survived and, made a new life for themselves, right? Maybe these men originally wanted to come forward, but then they changed their minds, afraid they'd be court-martialed or withdrawing from action, or they'd get in trouble or something. Or maybe they can't even be considered holdouts at all, as they just built new lives for themselves. And of course, there's always a possibility that they don't and never have existed at all, and this was just like some wild claim that someone made up to garner attention. Unfortunately, whatever the case is, I'm not sure we'll ever know the truth, as this 2005 story doesn't seem to have any ending in sight. And there have been other holdouts in war, of course. It's not as if this was the only time people haven't wanted to or haven't believed they should surrender. These are just some of the most famous examples. I doubt, though, that we'll hear about any more holdouts from World War II, though, but you never know. Maybe some 100-year-old soldier is going to pop out of a cave tomorrow and be wondering why everyone's carrying around tiny little computers in their pocket. What is a computer? What is a weeaboo? He's going to need to be brought up to speed is what I'm trying to say. And yes, I'm trying to be funny, but it should also be noted that this is a really tragic story because a lot of innocent people lost their lives because of, really poisonous ideology, I guess. What do you think the reasons are? Anyway, thanks so much for joining today. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Past Pass. I hope you learned something. Come check out my channel. It's called A Voyage of Being. And also check out some of the other Thinkology videos. They're all great. But while you're here, like, subscribe, share, and comment, and do all that good stuff if you liked the episode. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.